Long ago, an emperor sat in marble halls and pondered the origins of his world. Augustus Caesar ruled an empire born from decades of brutal civil war. Yet he understood that power alone could never sustain a nation. A great culture needed a sacred myth of where it came from. To craft this origin story, Augustus turned to a quiet poet named Virgil. Virgil spent 11 years writing 12 masterly books of verse. His creation, the Aeneid became the foundational epic of Western literature. For 2,000 years, scholars and students have remembered its verses. The narrative did not begin with golden arches or triumphant conquests. It began in the embers of total catastrophe. It began on a dark night when one of history's greatest cities crumbled into ash. The ancient city of Troy had endured 10 long years of bitter siege. On one quiet evening, its tired defenders finally believed the war was over. The Greek fleet appeared to have vanished into the misty horizon. A massive wooden horse stood outside the gates, a apparent offering of peace. Inside their homes, the Trojans slept deeply for the first time in a decade. Among them was Prince Aeneas, a trusted leader and son of the goddess Venus. He was not on the battlements that fateful night. He rested peacefully beside his aging father, Anchises, and his young son, Ascanius. As Aeneas slept, a dark shadow entered his dreams. It was the spectre of Prince Hector, the fallen champion of Troy. Hector did not appear as the radiant hero who once commanded armies. He appeared pale, disfigured, and covered in the dust of the battlefield. His beard was matted with dried blood from his final combat. His body bore the terrible wounds of the chariot that dragged him in life. He looked down at Aeneas with the calm sadness of the dead. "Get up," the ghost warned quietly in the darkness. "Troy is falling, and the enemy already holds the walls." Hector did not command Aeneas to draw a sword or seek a glorious death. Instead, he laid a heavy duty upon his cousin's shoulders. He instructed Aeneas to gather the ancient penates the sacred household gods. These carved figures represented the spiritual life of their lineage. Aeneas was ordered to carry them away across the vast ocean. He was tasked with finding a distant shore where new walls could rise. Aeneas awoke abruptly as the nightmare faded into memory. The sounds echoing through his courtyard were not the sounds of dawn. He heard distant screams, metal clashing, and the roar of spreading fire. The wooden horse had opened from within, unleashing Greek warriors into the heart of Troy. Stepping onto his rooftop, Aeneas looked out over his homeland. The night sky was illuminated by an awful orange glow. The city was not simply losing a battle. It was being systematically consumed. Greek soldiers moved through familiar streets with terrifying precision. They had spent a decade studying Troy from outside the walls. Now they executed their final plan with cold efficiency. Ancient grand halls were collapsing into piles of burning rubble. Aeneas felt the immediate instinct of a trained warrior. He donned his bronze armor and gathered a small band of desperate comrades. Together, they plunged into the smoke-filled thoroughfares. They fought fiercely in the narrow alleys, seeking to hold back the tide. He watched lifelong friends fall in the darkness. He witnessed the sacred palace of King Priam violated by ruthless invaders. Old men were slain upon the altars where they had prayed for decades. Yet amid the carnage, Aeneas realized that sword and shield were useless. As he stood amid the burning ruins, a luminous form materialized before him. It was his mother, Venus, shimmering with heavenly light. She did not arrive to join the fighting or grant him victory. She came to open his eyes to a truth no mortal could see alone. Venus gently touched his brow, granting him temporary divine sight. The veil of mortality parted, revealing the true forces destroying Troy. It was not merely Greek soldiers tearing down the ramparts. The immortal gods themselves were presiding over the end of the city. Aeneas watched in awe as Juno directed the destruction with bitter resolve. Neptune was striking the foundations with his trident, shattering stone walls. Athena unleashed overwhelming force upon the fortifications. Even Jupiter had turned his face away, signaling that Troy's time was done. Venus spoke softly to her son amid the divine thunder. "This is not a battle you can win with mortal strength," she explained. "The fate of Troy is sealed by powers far above human choice. Your duty is not to die here, but to survive and carry what remains." With the divine vision fading, Aeneas sprinted back through the burning streets. He reached his family home, where his household waited in terror. His father, Anchises, was an old man, weakened by age and past infirmity. Once loved by Venus in his youth, Anchises now sat fragile amid the encroaching flames. Aeneas urged his father to prepare to flee immediately. Surprisingly, Anchises refused. The old man looked upon the destruction and felt his life had reached its end. He saw no purpose in surviving the fall of everything he had ever known. Anchises urged his son to take young Aeneas and run. "I am too old to wander as a refugee," the patriarch said quietly. "Let me die here in the city I have called home my entire life." Aeneas stood firm, refusing to leave his father behind to perish. As the argument grew tense and time slipped away, a quiet miracle occurred. Little Aeneas stood near the doorway, watching his elders in fear. Suddenly, a gentle flame appeared above the child's head. It was not a fire that burned or harmed the boy. It was a soft halo of divine light, radiating peace and hope. Both Aeneas and Anchises recognized the phenomenon instantly. It was a sign of divine favor, a sacred marker placed upon the child by the gods. Seeing the light, Anchises lowered his head and reconsidered. The old patriarch understood that the future did not belong to him. It belonged to the child with the light upon his brow. "Carry me," Anchises said softly to his son. "I am ready to go." In that burning room, an iconic image of ancient history took shape. Aeneas strapped on his bronze armor, taking up his destiny. He lifted his frail father onto his heavy shoulders. Anchises held the sacred asterisk penates asterisk securely in his hands. With his right hand, Aeneas grasped the small hand of his son, Aeneas. He instructed his wife, Creusa, to follow closely behind their footsteps. "Stay within our shadow," he urged her through the thick smoke. "Do not fall behind in the dark." Step by heavy step, Aeneas moved through the burning streets. He carried the weight of his father, the past, upon his shoulders. He led his son, the future, by the hand. Around them, 1,000 years of culture was crumbling into memory. He navigated forgotten alleys, avoiding Greek patrols and blazing timber. His familiar city felt alien, rendered terrifying by fire and chaos. Yet, his focus remained absolute as he neared the outer city gates. Passing through the stone archway, they emerged into the cool night air outside. Aeneas paused to set his father down and gather his family. He looked back into the dark, but Creusa was nowhere to be seen. A cold panic seized the prince. He checked among the small group of surviving Trojans who had followed them. No one had seen her. She had been lost in the confusion of the flight through the city. Disregarding his own safety, Aeneas did something extraordinary. He left his father and son under guard and ran back into the inferno. Aeneas braved the Greek-controlled streets once more, calling his wife's name. His voice echoed off burning stone and shattered doorways. He searched frantically near their ruined home, finding only emptiness. Then, a familiar figure appeared before him in the gloom. It was the spectre of Creusa. She appeared larger than life, serene and free from the panic of the living. Aeneas reached out to embrace her, but his hands passed through empty air. "Do not weep for me, my husband." Her ghost spoke gently. "My journey ends here, protected by the great mother of the gods." She revealed that her separation was not an accident of fate. It was ordained that she should remain with the land of her ancestors. Creusa spoke of a long voyage across vast ocean waters awaiting Aeneas. She foretold a distant western land where peace and a new royal bride awaited him. "Grieve for me shortly," she urged softly. "Save your love for our son, and carry our lineage to its new home." With those final words, her image dissolved into the night mist. 3 times Aeneas tried to hold her, and 3 times she slipped away like wind. Heartbroken yet resolved, he turned back toward the city gates. He returned to Anchises, Ascanius, and the gathered Trojan refugees. More survivors had emerged from the shadows. Women, children, and weary warriors. They recognized in Aeneas a leader who could guide them through catastrophe. Aeneas led the solemn procession up into the cold slopes of Mount Ida. From the high pine forests, they looked down upon the Trojan plain. The great city was now a sea of glowing embers and thick black smoke. 1,000 years of power and tradition had vanished in a single night. Yet, in the dark mountain air, the survivors drew their capes tight. They carried the sacred artifacts of their past and the hope of their future. Ahead lay a vast, unforgiving ocean, and a destiny they could not yet comprehend. The exile began in the quiet sanctuary of the mountain pine forests. High above the ruined plain, Mount Ida provided temporary shelter from Greek patrols. The survivors established a hidden camp among the towering trees. The mountain air was cold, fresh, and mercifully clear of thick smoke. For months, the forest echoed with the rhythmic bite of iron axes. Fallen timber was dragged down to the shore to construct a fleet. There was a quiet irony in the timber they harvested. The very same forests had supplied wood for the Greek horse. Now, those pine trees would build the vessels of Trojan survival. 20 sturdy ships slowly took shape upon the shoreline. Anchises, though frail, found renewed purpose among the refugees. He carried the spiritual history of their people in his memory. He guided the young and offered quiet wisdom to his son. When spring arrived, the fleet was readied for the open ocean. Provisions were loaded, and the sacred household gods were carefully secured. Anchises gave the signal to cast off the thick ropes. Aeneas stood at the stern of the flagship, watching the shoreline recede. The hills of his homeland faded slowly into the blue mist. Tears filled the eyes of hardened warriors and weary mothers alike. They were no longer citizens of a proud kingdom. They were a floating community without a country or a home. Behind them lay embers and graves. Ahead lay infinite water. The fleet sailed across the northern waters toward the coast of Thrace. The Thracian king had long been an ally of Troy. Aeneas hoped this familiar coastline would offer safe refuge. The refugees landed upon a fertile shore near a winding river. Aeneas immediately began planning their first new settlement. He laid out stone foundations and ordered the construction of altars. To prepare a sacrifice to Venus, Aeneas climbed a nearby hill. He sought green branches to decorate the sacred altar stone. He spotted a dense thicket of myrtle bushes growing nearby. Aeneas grasped a leafy branch and pulled it from the earth. As the roots tore free, a horrifying sight unfolded. Dark, thick drops of blood oozed from the broken wood. The dark liquid stained the grass and the stones below. Aeneas pulled a second branch, and again blood trickled forth. Terror chilled the prince as he fell to his knees. Then, a mournful voice echoed from deep within the earth. "Why do you tear my flesh, Aeneas?" The voice groaned softly. "Spare a buried countryman, and do not pollute your hands." It was the spirit of Polydorus, the youngest son of Priam. Years earlier, Priam had sent Polydorus to Thrace for safekeeping. The boy had carried a vast fortune in gold to secure his future. When Troy fell, the greedy Thracian king betrayed his ancient oath. He murdered the young prince and seized the Trojan gold. He cast the boy's body into a shallow grave. The wooden spears used in the murder had taken root in his flesh. Over time, they had grown into the dense myrtle thicket. The land was permanently tainted by treacherous murder and greed. Aeneas knew they could not build a future on polluted soil. The Trojans gathered to perform solemn funeral rites for Polydorus. They raised a high mound of earth and poured sacred libations. With his spirit finally at peace, the fleet boarded their ships. They fled the cursed shore of Thrace without looking back. The ships journeyed south into the heart of the Aegean Sea. They raised the sacred island of Delos, birthplace of Apollo. The island offered sanctuary and a quiet harbor for the weary travelers. King Aeneas, an old friend of Anchises, welcomed them with open arms. He wore the sacred wreath of Apollo and offered generous hospitality. The Trojans rested, bathing away the salt and sorrow of the sea. Aeneas entered the ancient marble temple of Apollo to pray. He knelt before the holy altar, seeking direction for his people. "Grant us a home, Apollo," he pleaded softly into the silence. "Grant us lasting walls and a future for our children." Suddenly, the marble floor shook, and the laurels trembled. A powerful voice echoed through the sacred shrine, like thunder. "Hardy children of Dardanus," the god commanded mysteriously. "Seek out your ancient mother," the oracle instructed. "There, the house of Aeneas shall rule over all shores." The prophecy was brief, regal, and maddeningly cryptic. The refugees gathered on the beach to decipher the god's words. What did Apollo mean by their ancient mother? Anchises stepped forward, searching his vast knowledge of royal lineages. He recalled the ancient stories of Teucer, an early Trojan patriarch. Teucer had originally come from the fertile island of Crete. To Crete, Anchises declared with quiet confidence, "That is where our lineage began. That is our ancient mother." Rejoicing, the Trojans offered sacrifices and set sail once more. The fleet steered south toward the great island of Crete. They arrived at a lush coastline framed by distant mountains. The land appeared welcoming, fertile, and rich with promise. Aeneas immediately laid out the boundary lines for a new city. They named the settlement Pergamum, honoring the citadel of old Troy. Houses were built, laws were established, and fields were plowed. Young couples married, and a sense of normalcy returned. For a brief moment, it seemed the long nightmare was over. The refugees believed they had finally found their permanent home. Then, disaster struck without warning. A stifling heat settled over the island, corrupting the air. A sudden, terrible plague began to sweep through the settlement. Livestock collapsed in the fields, their bodies bloated and diseased. Then, the people themselves began to fall ill and perish. The green crops withered in the soil before harvest. The dream of Crete transformed into a devastating nightmare. Anchises suggested sending envoys back to Delos to ask Apollo again. But that night, the answer came directly to Aeneas. Aeneas lay awake in his room, weighed down by heavy sorrow. Moonlight filtered through the high window, illuminating his bed. Suddenly, a divine light filled the quiet room. Standing before him were the sacred asterisk penates asterisk, the household gods. These were the very statues he had carried out of burning Troy. They spoke to him with clear, reassuring voices in the darkness. "Apollo speaks to you through us tonight, Aeneas," they declared. "Crete is not your destined home." Anchises was mistaken. They explained that Teucer was not the ancestor Apollo intended. The god was referring to Dardanus, the true founder of Troy. Dardanus had not come from Crete, he had come from Italy. Hesperia is its ancient name, the statues revealed softly. A land of rich soil and powerful warrior tribes. That is your ancient mother. That is where your walls must rise. The vision faded, leaving Aeneas filled with awe and clarity. He immediately woke his father and reported the divine message. Anchises recognized his mistake and bowed his head in humble understanding. Once again, the Trojans packed their belongings and boarded the ships. They left the plagued shores of Crete behind, turning their prows west. As the fleet ventured into open western waters, the sea turned violent. Dark clouds swallowed the sun, obscuring the stars for days. The ships drifted helplessly, driven off course by howling gales. Palinurus, the skilled helmsman, could not navigate in the pitch black. For 4 days, the refugees were at the mercy of the ocean. On the 5th morning, land finally appeared through the fog. It was the Strophades, a cluster of small, isolated islands. Exhausted and famished, the Trojans steered into a sheltered bay. Stepping onto the firm shore, they discovered herds of cattle grazing freely. Goats roamed the grassy hills without herdsmen or guards. Overjoyed at their fortune, the starving refugees slaughtered several animals. They built fires on the beach and began to prepare a feast. They gave thanks to the gods and sat down to eat. Suddenly, A horrific screeching echoed from the high cliffs. Dark shapes dropped from the sky like sudden thunderbolts. They were the Harpies, terrifying creatures of divine vengeance. They possessed the pale, distorted faces of starving women. Yet their bodies were those of giant birds with filthy feathers. They had razor-sharp talons and emanated an unbearable stench. The creatures swooped over the fires, snatching food from hands. What they did not eat, they fouled with vile, toxic waste. The feast was instantly ruined, transformed into a disgusting wreck. Aeneas ordered his men to move the tables into a hidden cave. They relit the fires and tried to eat in secret, but the Harpies returned, shrieking and polluting the meat once more. Enraged, Aeneas commanded his warriors to draw their bronze swords. They concealed their weapons under the sand, waiting for the attack. When the monsters swooped down again, the Trojans struck with fury. Yet their bronze blades passed uselessly through the creatures' feathers. The Harpies were immortal beasts, impervious to mortal iron. One monster, their leader Celaeno, perched upon a high rock. She looked down at the Trojans with dark, menacing eyes. "Is it war you bring us, Trojans?" Celaeno shrieked bitterly. "You slaughter our cattle and now draw weapons against us." She delivered a chilling prophecy that echoed over the bay. "You will indeed reach Italy. The gods will grant you passage. But you shall not build your promised city walls until terrible hunger forces you to eat your very tables." The dark curse settled over the refugees like a heavy shroud. Their hearts sank with fear and quiet dread. To be so hungry that one must consume wooden tables sounded awful. Anchises raised his hands to the heavens, praying to ward off the curse. He pleaded with the gods to protect his weary people. Aeneas ordered the men to cut the mooring lines immediately. They pushed off from the sinister islands, fleeing into the sea. The wind filled their white sails, driving them north and west. Ahead lay unknown coasts, mysterious kingdoms, and ancient seers. The curse of the Harpies echoed in their minds, a dark shadow over the horizon. The fleet moved north along the rugged coast of Epirus. The sea was surprisingly calm, reflecting the pale morning sky. Weary sailors rested their oars, letting the gentle breeze guide them. Aeneas ordered the ships to put in at a quiet harbor. They landed near the mouth of a clear, winding river. Strange rumors had reached the refugees from passing merchant vessels. A Trojan prince was reportedly ruling a kingdom nearby. Intrigued and hopeful, Aeneas led a small party inland. They walked through a quiet grove of silver olive trees. Suddenly, the soft sound of solemn chanting drifted through the air. The words were spoken in the ancient dialect of Troy. Aeneas stepped into a sunlit clearing and froze in disbelief. Before him stood a miniature city, crafted out of white stone. It was a ghost of his fallen home. There was a scaled replica of the great Scaean gate. A small stream had been carefully renamed the Simois River. It was a city built entirely out of memory and grief. In the center of the grove knelt a solitary woman. She was dressed in dark mourning robes, pouring libations over an empty tomb. It was Andromache, the widow of noble Prince Hector. She was offering sacred gifts to the memory of her fallen husband. When she looked up and saw Aeneas, she turned deathly pale. The golden vessel slipped from her trembling hands. "Are you a living man?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Or does Hector send a phantom to mock my sorrow?" Aeneas stepped forward, comforting the weeping princess. He assured her that he was alive, a fellow survivor of catastrophe. Tears flowed freely as two remnants of a lost world embraced. Andromache introduced them to her new husband, Helenus, a son of Priam. Helenus was a gifted prophet who had survived the war's chaotic aftermath. Together, they had built this small sanctuary to preserve their past. Helenus welcomed his Trojan kinsmen into his grand hall. They shared a rich feast, pouring wine to honor their survival. For several days, the refugees rested in the comfort of familiar customs. Andromache looked upon young Ascanius with profound tenderness. The boy reminded her of her own son, Astyanax, who had perished at Troy. She presented Ascanius with a beautiful, hand-woven cloak. "Take this gift from my own hands, sweet boy," she said softly. "You are the living image of my lost child." Before their departure, Aeneas sought the prophetic counsel of Helenus. They walked together to the quiet temple of Apollo. Aeneas asked for guidance regarding the dangerous voyage to Italy. Helenus entered a divine trance, his voice growing distant and grand. "Listen closely, Aeneas," the seer warned. "Your journey is far from over." He instructed the prince to avoid the short path to western Italy. The narrow strait of Messina was guarded by two horrific terrors. On one side lived Scylla, a multi-headed monster lurking in sea caves. On the other side raged Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that swallowed ships whole. "You must sail all the way around Sicily," Helenus commanded. "Choose the longer, safer route around the western cape." Helenus offered one final, vital piece of divine advice. "When you finally reach the shores of Italy, seek out Cumae," he urged. "Find the ancient prophetess known as the Cumaean Sibyl. She lives in a dark cave near the Bay of Naples," he explained. "She alone holds the secrets of your war in Italy." Finally, the seer emphasized the need to appease their divine enemy. "Pray constantly to Queen Juno," Helenus insisted. "Offer sacred sacrifices to soften her relentless wrath." With these warnings burning in his mind, Aeneas returned to the fleet. Gifts of silver, gold, and bronze armor were loaded onto the ships. The Trojans bade a tearful farewell to their kin in Epirus. They pushed off into the sparkling waters of the Ionian Sea. The white stone walls of the miniature Troy slowly vanished behind them. Following the seer's warnings, they steered south toward the island of Sicily. As they approached the eastern coast, a low, terrifying roar echoed over the waves. It was the distant thunder of Charybdis, churning the deep sea. Palinurus immediately swung the flagship's rudder hard to the right. The entire fleet veered west, shunning the deadly strait. For days, they skirted the towering, rocky coast of western Sicily. Thick plumes of black ash rose from Mount Etna in the distance. The earth trembled beneath the hull as subterranean fires burned. They reached the quiet harbor of Drepanum on Sicily's western tip. King Acestes, a ruler of Trojan descent, greeted them warmly on the beach. The refugees set up camp, grateful for firm ground. Yet, this peaceful stop held a heartbreaking tragedy. Anchises, who had survived the fall of Troy and years of wandering, grew terribly frail. The long, grueling sea journey had finally broken his old body. Surrounded by his loving son and grandson, Anchises quietly passed away. Aeneas fell to his knees, weeping over his father's still form. "Here I lost my greatest comfort in every trouble." Aeneas mourned silently. They buried the patriarch with full heroic honors upon the Sicilian shore. With heavy hearts, the Trojans boarded their ships once more. Aeneas took the helm, carrying his father's memory like a solemn anchor. They set sail into the open Tyrrhenian Sea, steering toward Italy. High above the clouds, Queen Juno looked down upon the fleet. She saw the Trojan ships skimming safely across the blue waters. Her heart burned with bitter, unyielding hatred. Shall they truly reach Italy and build a new empire? She seethed into the heavens. "Not while I command the storms." Juno descended rapidly to the volcanic island of Aeolia. There, King Aeolus kept the fierce sea winds imprisoned in deep caverns. Juno offered Aeolus a radiant mountain nymph as his bride. In exchange, she demanded a terrifying favor: unleash the violent winds upon Aeneas. Aeolus struck the hollow mountain with his golden spear. Deep inside the rock, imprisoned winds howled in fury. The massive stone doors burst open, releasing a monstrous tempest. South winds and north winds rushed out together, churning the ocean into madness. Sky and light vanished instantly from the eyes of the Trojan sailors. Dark night settled over the waves, punctuated by flashes of lightning. Towering walls of black water rose toward the heavy clouds. Ships were lifted to the crests of ocean mountains, then plunged into dark abysses. Oars snapped like dry twigs under the crushing weight of the sea. Aeneas felt a cold shudder run through his exhausted body. He raised his hands to the roaring sky, his voice filled with sorrow. 3 times blessed were those who died beneath the walls of Troy, he called out into the gale. 3 ships were hurled against hidden rocks beneath the surf. 3 more were driven into treacherous sandbars near the shore. Aeneas watched helplessly as the flagship of his trusted friend went under. Trojans swam through the churning foam, surrounded by floating debris and armaments. Deep beneath the waves, Lord Neptune felt the ocean thrashing in chaos. He realized instantly that his sister Juno had bypassed his authority. Neptune rose smoothly through the dark waters in his golden chariot. He looked out over the scattered Trojan fleet with cold, measured fury. He summoned the wild winds with a stern gesture of his trident. "How dare you disturb my realm without my command?" He rebuked them. "Return to your mountain prison and tell your master I rule these waters." With a swift wave of his hand, Neptune smoothed the churning sea. The heavy storm clouds parted, allowing soft sunlight to break through. Sea gods dislodged the grounded ships from the jagged rocks. The vast ocean grew quiet, calmed by the Ocean King's presence. Only 7 ships remained together in the peaceful aftermath. Exhausted and drenched, the survivors steered toward the nearest shoreline. They entered a quiet, sheltered bay on the northern coast of Africa. Towering cliffs and dark pine forests framed the peaceful harbor. The Trojans pulled their battered craft onto the firm sand. They collapsed on the shore, weeping with gratitude for surviving the ocean. At Shates, Aeneas's loyal companion struck a flint spark onto dry leaves. Soon, small fires crackled on the beach, drying wet clothes and warming cold hands. They salvaged soaked grain from the hold, grinding it between stones. Aeneas climbed a steep, rocky cliff overlooking the ocean expanse. He searched the horizon frantically, hoping to spot his missing ships. Nothing moved upon the vast, empty water. Heavy sorrow pressed upon his heart as he turned back toward the woods. In the forest below, Aeneas spotted 3 stag deer grazing among the trees. He drew his bow and dropped the animals with clean, swift shots. They carried the meat back to the beach to prepare a nourishing meal. Aeneas spoke comforting words to his weary men, keeping his own doubts hidden. "We have survived worse than this, my friends," he reassured them. The next morning, Aeneas set out to explore the unknown territory. Accompanied only by its Shates, he walked quietly through the dense woods. High above, his divine mother Venus watched over her son with concern. She wrapped both men in a thick, invisible mist of divine light. Concealed from mortal eyes, Aeneas and its Shates climbed a high hill. Looking down into the valley below, they stood frozen in sheer wonder. A massive, wealthy city was rising rapidly out of the wilderness. Workers were laying stone foundations, raising city walls, and carving out harbors. This was Carthage, a thriving kingdom born from recent tragedy. Aeneas walked invisibly through the bustling avenues and crowded markets. "How fortunate are those whose walls are already rising," he whispered softly. They approached a magnificent marble temple rising in the city center. The grand shrine was dedicated to Queen Juno. As Aeneas stepped onto the bronze threshold, he stopped in quiet awe. The temple walls were covered in intricate, painted bronze reliefs. The artwork depicted the terrible battles of the Trojan War. He saw Priam, Hector, Achilles, and even his own image painted in stone. Tears welled in the prince's eyes as he touched the cold relief. "Even here in this far land," Aeneas murmured, "there are tears for human suffering." At that moment, the doors opened and Queen Dido entered the grand hall. She moved with effortless grace, surrounded by a procession of loyal lords. Dido was a ruler of extraordinary courage, wisdom, and tragic beauty. She too had fled catastrophe across the vast sea. Her evil brother Pygmalion had murdered her beloved husband Sychaeus in Tyre. Dido had gathered loyal citizens, stolen the royal treasure, and fled. She had bought land from local chieftains and built this thriving empire. Dido took her seat upon a high throne, administering justice to her people. Suddenly, a commotion echoed at the temple doors. To Aeneas's overwhelming joy, the captains of his missing ships stepped forward. They had survived the storm and were seeking sanctuary from the queen. Dido listened with deep empathy as the Trojan captains told their story. "Do not fear, Trojans," she spoke gently from her throne. "My own past has taught me to comfort those who suffer." At her gracious words, Venus dissolved the invisible mist surrounding Aeneas. The prince stepped forward into the radiant light, visible to all. Aeneas stood before the queen, glowing with a divine grace granted by his mother. His dark eyes reflected the soft light of the great temple. Dido gasped softly, stepping back in sheer astonishment. "I am Aeneas, the man you seek," he spoke gently, "the survivor of Troy's final bloody night." He offered profound thanks to the queen for her extraordinary mercy toward his people. Dido looked upon the noble prince with a sense of wonder. She recognized a fellow exile who had endured unimaginable loss. "Come into my palace, prince," she offered warmly. "My home is open to you and your men." The queen ordered a grand banquet to celebrate the arrival of the Trojans. Servants hurried through the marble halls, preparing tables of rich wood. Oxen were slaughtered, and fine Phoenician wines were poured into silver cups. High above, Venus watched the blossoming friendship with deep anxiety. She knew that Carthage was a city favored by Queen Juno. She feared that Dido's kindness might turn to hostility under divine pressure. Venus devised a cunning plan to protect her mortal son. She summoned Cupid, the god of love, to aid her in secret. Venus carried young Ascanius away to a peaceful, hidden grove on Cyprus. She placed the young boy in a deep, magic slumber among blooming flowers. Cupid assumed the exact likeness of Ascanius, wearing the boy's royal clothes. He entered the Carthaginian palace, disguised as Aeneas's young son. During the lavish feast, Dido held the child affectionately in her arms. She rocked him gently, unaware of the divine presence she embraced. Cupid quietly began his secret, invisible work. He slowly erased the memory of Dido's dead husband, Sychaeus, from her heart. In its place, he planted a deep, burning passion for Aeneas. The poison of love seeped quietly into her soul with every breath. Dido hung on every word Aeneas spoke throughout the long evening. She asked him to detail his long years of wandering across the ocean. By midnight, the Carthaginian queen was hopelessly in love with the Trojan hero. As the weeks passed into months, a deep romance blossomed between them. Aeneas found comfort in Dido's warmth and the security of Carthage. For the first time in 7 years, he felt a sense of home. One morning, the royal court embarked on a grand deer hunt in the mountains. Dido rode a magnificent white horse, wearing a cloak of royal purple. Aeneas rode beside her, enjoying the crisp mountain air. Suddenly, Juno unleashed a violent thunderstorm over the mountain slopes. Sheet rain and dark lightning scattered the royal hunting party into the woods. Seeking shelter from the deluge, Dido and Aeneas ran into a secluded cave. In the dark sanctuary of the cave, their love was sealed. Earth and sky witnessed their union, while lightning flashed across the sky. Dido called it a marriage, giving her full devotion to Aeneas. Yet this passionate union carried a heavy, unseen cost. The great construction projects of Carthage ground to a complete halt. Stone cranes stood idle against the sky, and city walls remained unfinished. The legal courts sat empty, and the harbors were left half-built. Queen Dido neglected her royal duties, completely absorbed in her love. Aeneas too seemed to forget the sacred mission given by the gods. Rumor flew rapidly across the kingdoms of North Africa. The personified monster of rumor spread exaggerated tales to neighboring rulers. King Iabas, a local African chieftain, heard the news with bitter anger. Iabas had been repeatedly rejected by Dido when he sought her hand. Enraged that she had chosen a wandering Trojan exile, he prayed to Jupiter. "Shall a foreign refugee claim what belongs to a prince of this land?" he cried out. Jupiter looked down from the high heavens upon the city of Carthage. He saw Aeneas lingering in comfort, neglecting his true fate. The king of the gods felt a sudden, cold resolve. Jupiter summoned Mercury, the fleet-footed messenger god. He handed Mercury a stern, unyielding command for the Trojan prince. Fly down to Carthage instantly. Jupiter commanded the god. Ask Aeneas why he wastes time building walls for a foreign queen, Jupiter ordered. Remind him of the empire awaiting his son in Italy. Mercury strapped on his golden, winged sandals and descended through the clouds. He dropped down into the bustling courtyards of Carthage like a shooting star. Mercury found Aeneas standing upon a high stone rampart. The prince was supervising the construction of a lavish Carthaginian tower. He wore a cloak of bright purple silk, a gift woven by Dido. A jeweled sword decorated with gold hung carelessly at his waist. Aeneas looked like a Carthaginian ruler rather than a Trojan exile. Mercury materialized directly before him, his divine eyes burning with authority. Are you laying foundations for Carthage while forgetting your own kingdom? Mercury demanded. The ruler of high Olympus sends me directly to you, the god continued. If personal glory no longer moves you, consider your son, Aeneas. You owe him the fertile fields of Italy and the majesty of Rome, Mercury declared. Leave this shore immediately. That is your divine command. With those sharp words, Mercury vanished into thin air. Aeneas stood frozen in silent horror, his blood turning cold. Aeneas stood paralyzed upon the high stone rampart. The divine message echoed in his mind like thunder. He loved Dido. Yet the command of Jupiter was absolute. He summoned his trusted captains in secret. He ordered them to prepare the fleet quietly in the harbor. The ships were to be refitted and loaded without alerting the citizens. Aeneas sought the right moment to speak with the queen. He dreaded breaking the heart of the woman who had saved his people. Yet, true secrecy is impossible when love is involved. Rumor carried the dark news to Dido before Aeneas could speak. She heard that the Trojan fleet was preparing to sail. The queen flew into a desperate, tragic rage. She ran through the marble corridors, like a woman possessed. Dido confronted Aeneas in the central courtyard. Tears of betrayal and fury streamed down her pale face. Did you truly hope to sneak away from my land in secret? She cried out. Does our love, our sacred union, mean nothing to you? She reminded him of everything she had given his people. She had opened her kingdom and shared her wealth for his sake. If you leave me now, she wept, I am left completely alone. Aeneas felt a crushing weight upon his chest. He stood before her, holding back his own immense grief. His heart yearned to stay, but his duty commanded otherwise. I never promised a formal marriage, Dido, he answered softly. Nor do I leave these shores by my own free choice. He spoke of the divine visitations that haunted his sleep. He spoke of his sacred duty to his son Aeneas and the promised lands of Italy. The gods compel me to go, Aeneas explained quietly. Italy is my true home now. Dido looked at him with cold, bitter disdain. No goddess gave you birth, she seethed into the night. Go then, seek your distant kingdom across the violent sea. She turned away, collapsing into the arms of her frightened attendants. They carried the shattered queen into her private chambers. Aeneas returned to the harbor, his heart heavy with sorrow. He ordered the final preparations completed without delay. The Trojans loaded their remaining supplies under the cover of night. In the palace, Dido devised a desperate, fatal plan. She summoned her sister Anna, pretending to seek relief through ancient magic. She asked Anna to build a massive wooden pyre in the inner courtyard. Dido claimed the fire would burn Aeneas's leftover belongings. She gathered his purple cloak, his armor, and the bed they had shared. Anna, unaware of her sister's true intent, obeyed immediately. In the pre-dawn grey, Mercury appeared to Aeneas in a dream. The god warned him of immediate danger if he remained. Aeneas rushed to the harbor, ordering the mooring ropes cut. As the sun rose over North Africa, Dido looked out from her high tower. She saw the Trojan fleet far out at sea, their white sails catching the wind. The reality of her total abandonment crashed over her. She walked down to the courtyard where the high wooden pyre waited. Dido climbed the timber steps, standing beside the remnants of her lost love. She drew the bronze sword Aeneas had left behind. Let the harsh Trojan see these flames from the deep sea, she declared softly, and let him carry the omen of my death with him. Dido fell upon the sharp blade, ending her tragic pain. Screams of grief echoed through the avenues of Carthage. High above, Juno sent Iris down to release the queen's lingering spirit. Far out on the open sea, Aeneas looked back toward the shore. He saw dark plumes of smoke rising from the Carthaginian palace. A cold shudder passed through him, an uneasy premonition of a tragedy he could not see. The Trojan fleet pushed across the Tyrrhenian Sea, leaving the burning shores of Carthage behind. Yet unfavorable winds soon arose, threatening to drive the ships toward hazardous rocks. Palinurus, the master steersman, studied the darkening sky and choppy waters with deep concern. He advised Aeneas to alter course toward the welcoming shores of northwestern Sicily. Aeneas agreed, steering the fleet back to the familiar domain of King Acestes. Returning to Sicily felt like completing a circle, a brief return to safety. King Acestes came down to the beach, dressed in the pelt of a Libyan bear. He greeted his Trojan kinsmen with generous warmth and immediate hospitality. The refugees set up camp on the shore, grateful for food and firm ground. The next morning, Aeneas gathered his people to make a solemn announcement. Exactly 1 year had passed since his beloved father Anchises had died on this island. To honor his sacred memory, Aeneas decreed 9 days of ceremony and funeral games. On the 10th morning, the funeral games began under clear, sunny skies. The first event was a thrilling boat race between 4 grand Trojan vessels. Each ship was named after a legendary sea beast and crewed by proud sailors. The captains maneuvered aggressively around a distant rock marked with green garlands. Young Cloanthus held the inside line so tightly his oars nearly scraped the stone. Praying fervently to the ocean gods, Cloanthus pulled ahead to win a narrow victory. During a chaotic turn, Captain Gyas grew enraged at his overly cautious helmsman. He threw the man overboard into the surf, drawing laughter from the watching crowd. The foot race followed, featuring the fastest young runners among the Trojan refugees. Nissus held a strong lead until he slipped on sacrificial blood near the finish line. Rather than accept defeat, Nissus intentionally tripped his rival to allow his close friend Euryalus to win. Aeneas resolved the playful dispute by awarding generous prizes to every competitor. Next came the grueling boxing match, dominated by an aging local champion named Entellus. Though slow, Entellus used his immense strength and timing to defeat a boastful young warrior. To demonstrate his remaining power, the old champion struck a prize ox between the eyes, dropping it instantly. The archery contest provided a moment of divine wonder for the gathered spectators. Archers aimed their arrows at a fluttering dove tied to a tall wooden mast. King Acestes fired his arrow into the clear sky after the target had already fallen. Mid-air, his arrow suddenly burst into brilliant flames, tracing a burning comet path across the heavens. Aeneas recognized the phenomenon as a favorable omen and awarded Acestes the highest honor. Afterwards, young Ascanius led the Trojan boys in a majestic equestrian parade of intricate maneuvers. While the men celebrated the games, Queen Juno initiated another act of subtle sabotage. She sent Iris, disguised as an elderly Trojan woman, down to the beach. The Trojan women were deeply exhausted from 7 long years of wandering and loss. Iris incited them to burn the ships so they would be forced to settle permanently in Sicily. Fire quickly spread across the wooden hulls, sending thick black smoke into the afternoon sky. Aeneas ran to the shore and raised his hands to Jupiter, begging for immediate relief. Jupiter sent a heavy downpour, saving most of the fleet while 4 ships were lost to the flames. Troubled by the disaster, Aeneas sought counsel from the wise old advisor Nautes. Nautes suggested leaving the exhausted and elderly behind to found a peaceful new settlement with Acestes. That night, the spirit of Anchises appeared to Aeneas in a serene vision. Anchises approved of leaving the weary behind and commanded his son to visit him in the Underworld. He instructed Aeneas to seek out the Cumaean Sibyl upon reaching Italy to guide his descent. There you shall see the great destiny awaiting your lineage. Anchises promised quietly. The Trojans settled their weary kin and readied the remaining fleet for the final leg to Italy. They set sail under a starry night sky, moving peacefully across calm waters. Neptune had granted safe passage, but demanded one life in exchange for the fleet's protection. Sleep, personified as a divine force, descended upon the loyal helmsman Palinurus. Though Palinurus fought the heavy drowsiness, the god cast him overboard into the dark ocean. He fell into the cold waves, holding the wooden tiller he refused to release. Aeneas awoke to find the flagship drifting without a steersman near the Italian coast. Taking the helm himself, he guided the fleet forward as the long-sought shoreline materialized in the dawn light. The wooden prow scraped gently against the white sand of Cumae. At long last, the Trojan refugees set foot upon the promised Italian mainland. Young men leaped into the shallow surf, securing heavy mooring lines to rocks. They struck fires on the beach, grateful to touch the sacred soil of Hesperia. Aeneas did not linger among the celebrations on the shore. He walked up the steep, rocky paths toward the ancient temple of Apollo. The grand marble shrine overlooked the blue waters of the bay. According to legend, the temple had been built by Daedalus after his escape from Crete. Aeneas paused before the grand bronze doors of the sanctuary. Intricate carvings depicted the mythic history of the Cretan labyrinth. Yet one story was noticeably absent from the bronze metalwork. Daedalus had tried twice to carve the tragic fall of his son, Icarus. Twice, the father's grieving hands had failed to shape the memory in gold. A voice echoed from the shadowed entrance of a nearby cavern. It was the Cumaean Sibyl, the ancient prophetess of Apollo. She led Aeneas into the heart of a massive limestone cliff. The cavern possessed 100 natural openings carved into the stone. When the spirit of Apollo filled the prophetess, divine winds howled through every passage. Her hair flew wild, and her face transformed with otherworldly intensity. "Ask your questions, Trojan," her voice echoed like rushing water. "The god approaches. The god approaches." Aeneas fell to his knees, praying for guidance and lasting peace. Apollo spoke through the Sibyl with terrifying clarity. "You have survived the great perils of the ocean," the prophetess declared. "Yet far heavier trials await you upon Italian soil." She foretold a fierce war against local warrior tribes. A new Achilles had already been born in the land of Latium. "The river Tiber shall foam with torrents of blood," she warned softly. "A foreign bride shall once again ignite a deadly conflict." Aeneas heard the dark prophecy without flinching. Years of suffering had steeled his heart against future hardship. He made a quiet, profound request of the ancient prophetess. He asked her to guide him into the realm of the dead. He longed to see his father Anchises one last time, as promised in his dream. The Sibyl looked down at the prince with solemn respect. "The descent into Avernus is easy," she replied gently. "The gates of shadow stand open night and day, but to retrace your steps and return to the upper light," she warned, "that is the true struggle." She explained that 2 sacred duties must be fulfilled before the journey. Deep within a dark forest grew a hidden golden branch. The golden bough was sacred to Proserpina, queen of the Underworld. Only those chosen by fate could pluck the golden branch from its tree. If destiny permitted, the branch would yield effortlessly to his hand. Furthermore, a dead companion lay unburied upon the beach. His spirit polluted the fleet until proper funeral rites were completed. Aeneas returned to the shore, finding his men gathered in sorrow. Mycenaeus, the skilled fleet trumpeter, lay dead upon the sand. Mycenaeus had arrogantly challenged the sea gods with his bronze horn. Enraged by the mortal's pride, Lord Triton had dragged him into the surf. The Trojans immediately set to work building a massive funeral pyre. They ventured into an ancient, dark forest to fell towering oak trees. As the axes echoed through the dense woods, Aeneas searched the canopy. He prayed aloud for a divine sign to reveal the golden bough. Suddenly, 2 white doves descended from the clear sky. They were the sacred birds of his mother, Venus. The doves flew slowly through the forest, guiding Aeneas deeper into the dark woods. They perched high in the branches of a shadowed oak tree. Gleaming among the green leaves was a branch of solid, glowing gold. Its metallic leaves rustled softly in the gentle forest breeze. Aeneas stepped forward and reached out his hand. The golden bough snapped easily from the trunk, yielding to his touch. With the golden branch secured, Aeneas returned to complete the funeral. The body of Aeneas was burned upon a magnificent wooden altar. His ashes were placed in a bronze urn and buried beneath a high mound. To this day, the towering headland bears his name, Cape Misenum. As night fell, Aeneas and the Sibyl walked toward Lake Avernus. The dark volcanic lake was framed by dense woods and noxious vapors. No bird could fly over its sulfuric waters without falling lifeless from the sky. Beside a gaping cave, the Sibyl sacrificed 4 black bulls. She poured sacred libations and summoned the dark deities of the underworld. The ground groaned beneath their feet, and the forest trees trembled. Howling hounds echoed from the dark depths of the cavern. "Stand back, all who are uninitiated," the Sibyl commanded the Trojans. She looked at Aeneas, her eyes burning with intensity. "Draw your sword, prince, and summon all your courage," she instructed. Together, they stepped into the pitch-black entrance of the underworld. They walked through misty shadows, like travelers under a faint moon. In the entry hall of Hades dwelt personified human horrors. Grief, anxiety, disease, old age, and fear lurked in the gloom. Hunger, poverty, and death crouched beside the dark stone walls. Nearby stood a giant elm tree, holding false dreams under every leaf. Terrifying monsters of myth loomed in the misty corridors. Centaurs, gorgons, and the multi-headed hydra hovered in the darkness. Aeneas drew his sword in instinctual terror. The Sibyl checked his arm, reminding him they were merely hollow phantoms. They reached the murky waters of the river Styx. A vast crowd of unburied souls stood upon the muddy bank. They stretched their hands out in silent longing, begging for passage across. Charon, the filthy, ancient ferryman, guided his dark boat through the mist. He accepted only those whose bodies had received proper burial. When Charon spotted a living warrior approaching, he shouted angrily into the dark, "Halt, living man! No mortal may cross these waters." The Sibyl stepped forward, revealing the hidden golden bough. At the sight of the sacred branch, Charon fell silent. He turned his dark boat toward the bank, inviting them to step aboard. The heavy wooden boat groaned under the unaccustomed weight of a living man. Dark water seeped through the ancient timber seams as Charon rowed across the river. Aeneas and the Sibyl stepped onto the muddy banks of the underworld interior. The terrifying roars of Cerberus echoed through the gloomy caverns. The giant, 3-headed hound guarded the gateway to the deeper shade realms. 3 dark necks bristled with poisonous serpents as the beast barked ferociously. The Sibyl stepped forward, tossing a small cake mixed with honey and sleeping herbs. Cerberus caught the morsel in midair, swallowing it whole. Within moments, the monster's 3 heads drooped as deep sleep took hold. Aeneas and his guide slipped past the sleeping guardian into the shadowy depths. They walked through regions filled with infant spirits and those wrongfully condemned. Soon, the path entered the dim, misty expanse of the fields of mourning. This shadowed landscape was reserved for those who had perished from tragic love. Dense myrtle groves concealed weeping spirits wandering among silent paths. Aeneas paused, noticing a familiar, noble figure standing in the gloom. It was Queen Dido. Her spirit freshly arrived from the pyre in Carthage. Tears welled in the prince's eyes as he stepped toward her. "Was the news true then, Dido?" he whispered in profound sorrow. "Did your own hand end your life?" "I swear by the gods above and below," Aeneas pleaded into the darkness. "I left your shore against my will, driven by divine command." Dido kept her dark eyes fixed firmly upon the ground. She refused to look upon him or acknowledge his weeping voice. Her face remained as cold and unyielding as flint or marble stone. Without a word, she turned away, fleeing into the shadowy grove. She vanished into the dark woods to join the comforting shade of Sychaeus. Aeneas watched her depart, his heart crushed by guilt and heavy sorrow. The Sibyl urged him forward, leaving the realm of tragic romance behind. They reached a fork in the path, where the road divided. To the left stood the colossal, iron-bound fortress of Tartarus. Triple walls and a roaring river of flame surrounded the terrifying prison. From within echoed groans of agony, the clanking of chains and harsh whips. The Sibyl explained that Tartarus held those who had committed irredeemable evil in life. To the right lay the path toward Elysium, the domain of the blessed. Aeneas placed the sacred golden bough upon the portal gateway as payment. They stepped into the golden, peaceful realm of Elysium. Here, a bright sun shone with soft, amber light under clear skies. Lush green meadows were filled with poets, heroes, and virtuous souls. Some wrestled on grassy fields, while others sang solemn hymns of joy. The Sibyl asked where they might find the spirit of noble Anchises. A local poet guided them toward a peaceful, secluded green valley. Anchises stood on a grassy hill, gazing intently upon a vast assembly of spirits. He was reviewing the uncounted souls of his future lineage. When Anchises spotted his living son approaching, his face lit with joy. He opened his arms wide, tears streaming down his gentle face. "You have come at last, my son," Anchises called out softly. "Your devotion has conquered the long, dangerous road." Aeneas stepped forward, weeping with overwhelming emotion. 3 times he tried to wrap his arms around his father's shoulders. 3 times the phantom form slipped through his embrace like wind or a dream. Yet their spiritual connection remained absolute and unbreakable. Aeneas noticed a wide, shimmering river flowing near a quiet woodland grove. Uncounted thousands of souls hovered around the water like buzzing bees in summer. Anchises explained that this was the peaceful river Lethe. Spirits drank its magical waters to erase all memory of their past mortal lives. Once purified, these souls were destined to be reborn into the world above. Anchises began to point out specific heroes waiting in the vast crowd. "Look closely, Aeneas," the patriarch instructed softly. "These are the future leaders of your bloodline." He pointed out Silvius, the son yet to be born to Aeneas in Italy. He revealed Romulus, the legendary warrior who would one day found Rome. Anchises showed him famous generals, statesmen, and great builders of nations. Finally, he pointed toward a grand figure standing in radiant light. It was Augustus Caesar, the emperor destined to bring a golden age of peace. He would expand the realm across distant lands to the ends of the earth. Anchises spoke the famous destiny that would define the Roman soul. "Remember, Roman, your art shall be to rule nations with justice, to impose the habit of peace, to spare the defeated and humble the proud." Filled with deep purpose and renewed strength, Aeneas listened intently. Anchises explained the trials waiting in the imminent war in Latium. He offered advice on securing alliances and enduring the battles ahead. Anchises then led his son and the Sibyl toward the gates of sleep. 2 grand gates offered exit from the underworld realm. One was made of solid horn, through which true visions passed to mortals. The other was carved from gleaming, polished ivory, carrying false dreams. Anchises escorted his visitors out through the gate of ivory. Aeneas re-emerged into the warm sunlight of the upper world near Cumae. He walked down to the shore, returning to his waiting crew. They raised the anchors and sailed north along the beautiful Italian coast. The ship steered smoothly into the mouth of the yellow river Tiber. Dense, green forests framed the calm waters of the riverbank. Birds sang in the quiet trees. As the Trojans pulled their craft onto the grass, they prepared a simple meal, laying roasted meat and wild berries upon flat cakes of hard wheat bread. Starving from the long voyage, the refugees ate all the food quickly. They then began breaking apart and eating the hard wheat bread plates. Young Ascanius laughed innocently as he chewed the crispy bread crusts. "Look, father," the boy called out happily. "We are eating our tables." Aeneas froze, a shock of joy racing through his veins. He remembered the dark curse delivered by the harpy Serlino long ago. The prophecy had been fulfilled harmlessly. They had consumed their bread tables. Aeneas fell to his knees, kissing the sacred soil of Latium. "Hail to the land promised to us by fate," he declared into the quiet forest. The morning sun rose warmly over the ancient territory of Latium. Gentle river breezes rustled the tall reeds along the banks of the Tiber. Aeneas set to work immediately, laying out a fortified coastal camp. His men dug shallow defensive trenches and raised wooden ramparts. For the first time in years, the Trojans built shelters with a sense of quiet permanence. Nearby stood the peaceful city of Laurentum, ruled by the elderly King Latinus. Latinus was a thoughtful sovereign, governing his people with wisdom and justice. He had no living sons to inherit his kingdom, only a single daughter, Lavinia. Lavinia was famed throughout the Italian tribes for her gentle beauty and grace. Many powerful local princes sought her hand in marriage. Her most prominent suitor was Turnus, the proud, fiery king of the Rutulians. Turnus was a warrior of exceptional prowess and noble blood. Queen Amata, Lavinia's mother, favored Turnus above all others. Yet King Latinus hesitated to grant his consent. Troubling omens and divine voices had echoed through the sacred groves of Latium. The oracle of Faunus had delivered a clear, unyielding warning to Latinus. "Do not wed your daughter to a prince of Italian stock." The oracle commanded, "A foreign stranger shall arrive upon your shores." The voice had foretold, "From his union with your daughter shall rise a name that reaches the stars." Latinus held these words tightly in his heart, waiting for fate to reveal itself. When news reached his palace of foreign ships landing at the Tiber, he listened intently. Aeneas selected 100 envoys to travel to the royal city of Laurentum. They wore wreaths of sacred olive leaves and carried rich gifts from Troy. They were led by noble Ilioneus, a trusted elder of the Trojan fleet. The envoys walked along the peaceful stone roads toward the grand palace of Latinus. The palace was a majestic wooden structure, supported by 100 massive columns. Statues of ancient Latin kings, carved from cedar, guarded the high threshold. Latinus received the foreign messengers with dignity upon his sacred throne. He offered them comfortable seats and asked why they had come to his shores. Ilioneus stepped forward, offering golden bowls and royal garments saved from Troy. "We ask only for a small strip of land along your river." Ilioneus spoke quietly. "We come not as conquerors, but as survivors guided by divine prophecy." King Latinus looked upon the golden gifts, his mind racing with sudden realization. He recognized the fulfillment of the oracle's ancient words. This Trojan leader, Aeneas, was the prophesied foreign stranger. "Your request is granted, noble Trojans," Latinus declared with joyful confidence. "Take the land you require and live among my people in peace." He sent a message directly to Aeneas, inviting the prince to his royal palace. "I have a daughter," Latinus added softly, "and fate decrees she must marry a foreign prince." The envoys returned to the coastal camp with horses, rich gifts, and news of total alliance. It seemed the long years of wandering had finally ended in peace. High above the earth, Queen Juno looked down upon the fertile plains of Latium. She saw the Trojans building homes and celebrating their new alliance. Her heart burned with bitter, uncontrollable fury. Shall they truly win this land so easily? She seethed into the sky. She knew she could not alter the ultimate decrees of fate. Aeneas would eventually wed Lavinia and found his destined empire. Yet if I cannot prevent their destiny, Juno vowed bitterly, I shall make its price agonizingly high. Juno descended rapidly into the dark, terrifying depths of the underworld. She bypassed the peaceful shades and sought the dark cavern of Alecto. Alecto was a fury, a creature of pure venom, discord, and bloody vengeance. Serpents squirmed in her dark hair, and her eyes burned with toxic rage. "Grant me your terrifying aid, daughter of night," Juno commanded the monster. "Shatter this peaceful alliance and ignite a bloody war between Latins and Trojans." Alecto grinned horribly, her dark heart eager for destruction. She flew up to the upper world. Veiled in poisonous black mists, Alecto entered the royal palace of Laurentum in complete silence. She found Queen Amata sitting alone in her private chambers, her heart heavy with anxiety. The queen hated the idea of giving her daughter to a foreign exile instead of Turnus. Alecto plucked a dark, invisible serpent from her writhing hair. She hurled the viper into Amata's bosom, letting it slide unnoticed beneath her garments. The venom seeped quietly into the queen's veins, poisoning her mind with mad rage. Amata stormed through the palace, screaming against the Trojan alliance. She pleaded desperately with King Latinus to reject Aeneas and favor Turnus. When Latinus remained steadfast in his obedience to the oracle, Amata's madness peaked. She stole young Lavinia away from the palace under the cover of night. She hid the princess deep within the shadowed, wild mountain forests. Amata incited the Latin mothers to join her, dancing wildly like frenzied wild women. The royal household fell into total chaos, yet Alecto was far from finished. The Fury flew swiftly south to Ardea, the ancient capital of the Rutulians. She entered the silent bedchamber of Prince Turnus as he slept peacefully. Alecto assumed the appearance of an elderly priestess of Juno named Calliope. "Turnus," the phantom whispered into the dark room. "Will you sit idle while your promised bride is given to a foreign exile?" Turnus stirred in his sleep, responding with arrogant disdain. "Leave the affairs of war to men, old woman," he murmured slumberously. Enraged by his disrespect, Alecto dropped her mortal disguise. Her form expanded into horrifying majesty, her serpent hair hissing violently. She thrust a burning black torch deep into Turnus's chest. The prince leaped from his bed in a cold sweat, screaming for his armor. The poison of war and wounded pride rushed through his blood like liquid fire. All thought of peace vanished, replaced by an absolute desire for slaughter. Turnus ordered his captains to march instantly toward the kingdom of Latinus. He declared he would drive both Trojans and Latins from the land with iron and fire. Satisfied with her terrifying progress, Alecto sought a final spark to initiate bloodshed. She flew toward the green meadows near the banks of the Tiber. Young Aeneas was hunting in the forest, accompanied by his loyal hounds. Alecto touched the dog's nostrils with poisonous scent, driving them onto a fresh trail. The hounds chased a magnificent stag out of the dense woods into a sunlit clearing. This was no ordinary wild beast of the forest. The stag was a cherished pet belonging to Tyrrhes, the chief herdsman of King Latinus. Tyrrhes's young daughter, Silvia, had raised the creature from a fawn. She loved the stag dearly, decorating its antlers with flower garlands and bathing it daily. The gentle animal roamed the meadows freely, always returning home at twilight. Unaware of the beast's sacred status, Aeneas raised his bow in the woods. Guided by Alecto's unseen hand, his arrow flew straight and true. The arrow pierced the stag's flank, wounding the animal deeply. Groaning in pain, the bleeding beast stumbled back to Tyrrhes's cottage. It collapsed at Silvia's feet, crying out like a wounded human. Silvia struck her arms in grief, screaming for help into the valley. Tyrrhes and his strong sons grabbed axes, heavy clubs, and sharpened stakes. Local herdsmen swarmed out from the woods, filled with sudden, murderous rage. Alecto perched upon a cottage roof, blowing a terrifying war signal through a horn. The harsh sound echoed through the forests, summoning warriors from miles around. Trojan warriors rushed out from their nearby camp to protect young Aeneas. What began as a local dispute quickly erupted into a full-scale battle. Iron swords clashed against wooden clubs in the muddy farmyards. Blood stained the grass as men fell on both sides of the meadow. Young Olmo, the eldest son of Tyrrhes, was struck in the throat by an arrow. He collapsed into the dust, his young life pouring out upon the soil. The peaceful pastoral world of Latium was shattered in a single afternoon. The grieving herdsmen carried the bloody bodies of Olmo and their comrades to Laurentum. They paraded the slain through the city streets, demanding immediate war against Aeneas. Turnus arrived with his Rutulian army, amplifying the cries for vengeance. King Latinus stood firm against the howling crowd, refusing to declare war. He stood like a solid sea cliff, unyielding against crashing waves. Yet when he realized he could not quell the madness, Latinus withdrew in despair. Fate has broken us. The old king wept softly, locking himself inside his palace. An ancient tradition dictated that the chief magistrate must open the gates of war. The massive bronze doors of the Temple of Janus remained shut during peace. When war was declared, the doors were flung open to unleash the spirits of battle. King Latinus refused to touch the sacred bronze handles. Queen Juno herself descended from the heavens to complete the dark work. She struck the heavy bronze doors with her divine hand. The gates of war burst open with a thunderous, metallic roar that shook Latium. The entire region erupted into war, and the march of armies began. Across the sunlit hills of Latium, the harsh clatter of armaments echoed through quiet farming villages. Local blacksmiths turned iron plowshares into sharp blades and forged shields of bronze. Warrior tribes assembled under local chieftains, gathering beneath the bright banners of Prince Turnus. Among the Italian leaders marched Mezentius, an exiled Etruscan king infamous for his shocking cruelty. Beside him rode his noble young son, Lausus, who deserved a far gentler father. There also came Camilla, the formidable warrior queen, who led the swift Volscian cavalry. She could race across green fields of wheat without bending a single golden stalk. From his river ramparts, Aeneas looked out at the vast coalition assembling on the horizon. He realized his small band of Trojan refugees could not withstand such overwhelming numbers alone. Heavy anxiety weighed upon the prince's heart as he walked along the quiet riverbank at night. He collapsed on the cool grass near the water's edge, falling into a deep sleep. In his dream, the river god Tibrinus rose smoothly from the misty waters of the Tiber. The ancient deity wore a soft cloak of grey leaves, his hair crowned with river reeds. "Do not fear the gathering storm, son of Venus," the god spoke gently into the dark. "The anger of the heavens has passed. Your destined home is firmly here." Tibrinus instructed Aeneas to sail upriver to find a rustic settlement named Palanteum. The village was ruled by King Evander, an Arcadian exile, long at war with local tribes. "Seek Evander's alliance," the river god advised silently. "He will grant you the military strength your people desperately need." Aeneas awoke at dawn, offering fresh river water and quiet prayers to Tibrinus. He selected 2 sturdy galleys, rowing smoothly up the winding, reed-lined Tiber. The river god calmed his current, allowing the ships to glide effortlessly through dark pine forests. On the second afternoon, the Trojans pulled their boats onto a peaceful grassy hillside. It was the Palatine Hill, the very ground where the imperial city of Rome would one day rise. At that time, it was merely a rustic wooden village surrounded by quiet pastures and grazing sheep. King Evander was holding a solemn sacrifice to honor Hercules when the foreign ships appeared. Young Pallas, Evander's cherished son, leaped up from the feast, grabbing a spear to challenge the strangers. Aeneas stood on the prow, holding out a sacred olive branch of peace. "We are Trojans seeking King Evander," Aeneas called out softly across the clear water. Evander recognized the noble prince, recalling a memorable meeting with Anchises in his youth. The old king welcomed Aeneas warmly, leading him into his modest wooden palace. He shared simple food with his guest, showing him the rustic sights of his humble kingdom. Evander told Aeneas how Hercules had slain the terrifying monster Cacus on these very hills. The Arcadian ruler readily agreed to form a military alliance against Turnus and the Rutulians. "My own troop numbers are modest," Evander explained honestly to the Trojan prince, "but I shall send my young son, Pallas, to to fight under your personal command. Teach him the art of war, and return him safely to my arms." Evander also directed Aeneas toward the powerful Etruscan nation nearby. The Etruscans had recently overthrown the tyrant Mezentius and were seeking a foreign commander. Thousands of armored Etruscan warriors waited along the coast, ready to join the war. While Aeneas rested at Palanteum, his mother Venus visited the divine forge of Vulcan. She asked her divine husband to craft invincible armor for her mortal son. Deep beneath the volcanic island of Lipari, giant cyclopes forged fiery bronze and silver. Venus descended to a secluded grove near Palanteum, carrying the divine gifts. She placed a gleaming bronze breastplate, helmet, and sword beneath an ancient oak tree. Yet the centerpiece of the gift was a colossal, intricately carved shield. Forged upon its metal surface was the entire future history of the Roman people. Aeneas saw Romulus and Remus nursed by the she-wolf in a shadowy cave. He saw famous battles, heroic sacrifices, and the grand sea victory of Augustus Caesar at Actium. Aeneas did not yet comprehend the full historical meaning of the metal carvings. Yet he lifted the heavy shield onto his shoulder with quiet resolve. He carried the fame and destiny of his descendants into the gathering war, while Aeneas traveled north toward the Etruscan camps. Danger closed in upon his defenseless river fortress. High above, Queen Juno sent her messenger Iris down to the Rutulian camp. Iris found Prince Turnus resting near a sacred ancestral grove. "Turnus, the opportunity you have sought has arrived," the rainbow goddess whispered into his ear. "Aeneas has left his camp to gather foreign allies. Strike now while their leader is far away," she commanded. Turnus leaped to his feet, filled with sudden, fierce energy. He ordered his vast army to march immediately upon the Trojan fortifications along the Tiber. From their wooden watchtowers, the Trojan sentries spotted a massive cloud of dust rising over the plains. The enemy army advanced like a dark tide across the river valley. Aeneas had given strict orders before his departure. If attacked while he was away, the Trojans were not to engage in open battle on the plain. They were to stay behind their heavy wooden ramparts and defend the fortress walls. The refugees quickly closed the thick timber gates, securing the iron bolts. They manned the battlements with bows, spears, and heavy stones. Turnus rode around the quiet fortress on his charger, frustrated by their refusal to come out and fight, seeking to draw the Trojans into the open. Turnus turned his attention toward their fleet. The Trojan ships were moored quietly along the riverbank, tied to wooden posts. Turnus ordered his men to gather pine torches from nearby farmyards. The Rutulians swarmed the riverbank, hurling burning firebrands onto the wooden hulls. Smoke billowed into the afternoon sky as flames began to lick the timber hulls. Yet, these ships were no ordinary sea vessels. They had been built on Mount Ida using sacred pine trees blessed by Cybele, the mother of the gods. Cybele would not permit her sacred timber to burn into useless ash. A sudden divine thunderclap echoed through the clear heavens, stopping the attackers in their tracks. A powerful divine voice rang out across the river valley. "Do not fear for your ships, Trojans," the voice declared. "Turnus shall sooner burn the ocean than these sacred woods." The thick mooring ropes snapped of their own accord, as if sliced by invisible blades. The ships plunged their prows deep beneath the yellow river water. When they re-emerged from the river mouth, they were no longer wooden craft. They had transformed into radiant sea nymphs, shimmering with heavenly light. The divine maidens glided gracefully out into the open sea, vanishing into the deep blue water. The Rutulian soldiers stood frozen on the bank in sheer disbelief, terrified by the miracle. Yet Turnus refused to lose his fierce momentum. "The gods have stripped the strangers of their escape," he declared loudly to his men. As night fell over the river valley, the Rutulians encircled the Trojan camp. They lit hundreds of watchfires across the plain, drinking wine and celebrating their impending victory. Inside the shadowed fortress, the Trojan commanders held a tense midnight council. They desperately needed to send word to Aeneas, but the enemy camp blocked every road. Two young warriors stood sentry at the dark fortress gate. Nissus was a seasoned track hunter, fast, loyal, and skilled with a bow. Euryalus was his younger companion, renowned for his extraordinary beauty and brave spirit. The two young men shared a deep, unbreakable bond of friendship. "Look at the enemy camp." Euryalus, Nissus whispered in the darkness, pointing toward the glowing watchfires. "The Rutulians are heavy with wine, slumbering in the grass. I shall slip through their lines tonight," Nissus proposed softly. "I will navigate the dark hills and bring Aeneas back to our aid." Euryalus looked at his friend with quiet indignation. "Do you think I would let you face such danger alone?" the young warrior asked. "I go with you, Nissus, or I do not stay at all." Nissus pleaded with his young friend to stay behind in safety. He reminded Euryalus of his mother, who had left Troy to follow her son across the vast ocean. Yet Euryalus remained steadfast, refusing to abandon his comrade. The two young men brought their plan before the Trojan council. Young Aeneas embraced them both, tears of gratitude streaming down his cheeks. "Bring my father back safely," Aeneas promised quietly, "and I shall reward you with royal treasures, land, and honor." Nissus and Euryalus armed themselves, slipping quietly out through a shadowed postern gate. They moved like shadows through the high grass, entering the sleeping enemy camp. Rutulian soldiers lay scattered on the ground near extinguished campfires, surrounded by wine jars and discarded shields. Nissus drew his bronze sword, moving silently through the dark lines. They inflicted swift, silent slaughter upon the slumbering leaders, clearing a path through the camp. Yet as dawn approached, Nissus urged his friend to hurry toward the open forest. In his excitement, young Euryalus spotted a magnificent bronze helmet on the ground. It was decorated with gold and a high crest, belonging to a slain captain. Euryalus placed the shining helmet upon his head, eager to carry away a trophy of victory. It was a small, tragic mistake. They entered the dark pine forest, leaving the enemy fires behind. Yet a Rutulian cavalry unit led by Captain Volscens was riding toward the camp through the morning mist. A stray beam of moonlight caught the polished bronze of Euryalus' stolen helmet, gleaming through the trees. "Halt, strangers!" Volscens shouted into the shadowed woods. "State your business." Nissus and Euryalus bolted into the thick underbrush, seeking cover in the dark forest. The Rutulian horsemen surrounded the woods, blocking every escape path. Nissus escaped through the dense trees, reaching a clear hill on the far side. He looked back into the gloom, realizing with horror that Euryalus was missing. Re-entering the dangerous woods, Nissus spotted Euryalus surrounded by enemy horsemen. The boy was hopelessly trapped in the thick brush, weighed down by his heavy armor, hidden in the shadows. Nissus prayed to the moon goddess Diana, aiming his spear. His weapon flew through the dark, piercing a Rutulian captain. A second spear struck another rider, throwing the patrol into total confusion. Enraged by the hidden attack, Volscens drew his blade, turning upon young Euryalus. "You shall pay for both," Volscens screamed, raising his sword over the boy, unable to watch his friend die. Nissus burst from the shadows, shouting frantically into the glade. "Strike me," Nissus cried out, exposing himself to the enemy. "The deed is mine." He did nothing, yet Volscens drove his blade into Euryalus' chest before Nissus could reach them. The young warrior collapsed onto the damp grass, like a bright flower severed by a plow. His head drooped softly onto his shoulder, his life slipping into the dark soil, filled with wild, desperate grief. Nissus threw himself directly at Volscens. He ignored the swords striking his body, driving his blade into the captain's throat, slaying his friend's killer. Nissus fell dead over Euryalus' body, resting in final peace alongside his comrade. The morning sun rose over the river valley, revealing the tragic aftermath. The surviving Rutulians returned to their camp, carrying the bodies of their slain captains. Seeking to break the Trojan spirit, they placed the severed heads of Nissus and Euryalus upon high spears. They paraded the terrible trophies before the wooden ramparts of the Trojan fortress. Euryalus' mother stood on the fortress wall, hanging laundry in the morning breeze. When she looked out over the battlements, she spotted her son's head upon the enemy's spear. A heartbreaking shriek echoed across the river valley, stopping soldiers on both sides of the wall. She tore her hair and beat her breast, her voice filled with unbearable sorrow. "Is this how you return to me, my son?" She wept into the wind. "Did I cross the ocean only to leave your flesh to foreign birds?" Her grief was so profound, so absolute, that the Trojan warriors wept alongside her, their spirit for battle shaken. Aeneas ordered attendants to guide the weeping mother gently into her quarters. Turnus seized the moment of distraction, ordering a full assault upon the fortress. Rutulian soldiers threw heavy ladders against the walls, attempting to scale the ramparts. They rolled massive wooden siege towers forward, hurling burning torches over the battlements. The Trojans fought back with desperate fury, hurling heavy rocks down onto the attackers. They pushed ladders away with long pikes, pouring boiling oil onto the siege engines. During the chaotic fighting, two giant Trojan brothers, Pandarus and Bitias, made a rash decision. Arrogant in their immense size and strength, they threw open the heavy fortress gates. "Step forward, Rutulians," Pandarus shouted, standing in the open archway. "Enter if you dare." They hoped to lure the enemy into a deadly trap inside the gateway, yet Turnus saw the open gate, rushing to the entrance like a lion targeting prey. Turnus struck down Bitias with a massive spear, crashing his towering frame onto the earth. Pandarus tried to force the massive wooden doors shut, but Turnus slipped inside the fortress grounds. Pandarus swung his heavy broadsword at Turnus's head with all his strength, yet Juno diverted the blade, saving the Rutulian prince. Turnus raised his own shining sword, striking Pandarus between the eyes. The giant Trojan collapsed in the dusty gateway, his skull shattered. Panic swept through the Trojan defenders as Turnus rampaged inside their inner fortress grounds. Had Turnus thought to open the gates for his waiting army, the Trojan cause would have ended that morning. Yet his mind was completely consumed by the wild joy of battle. He chased fleeing warriors through the narrow fortress avenues, slaying all who crossed his path. Finally, noble Mnestheus rallied the frightened Trojans near their homes. "Where else do you plan to run?" Mnestheus shouted to his men. "Shall one man slaughter our people inside our own walls?" Ashamed of their panic, the Trojans regrouped, forming a solid bronze wall of spears around Turnus. Outnumbered and exhausted, Turnus backed slowly toward the river wall. Sweat and blood poured from his face, his armor battered by endless spear strikes. Juno could no longer assist him, for Jupiter had sent Iris with a stern command. Turnus must leave the Trojan fortress immediately, or face divine wrath, trapped against the wooden ramparts, with the Trojans pressing close. Turnus made a daring leap. He turned and leaped backward into the rushing yellow waters of the Tiber River, fully armored. The river god Tibrinus received the prince gently into his cool stream. The gentle current washed the blood and dust from Turnus's battered armor. It carried him smoothly downstream, delivering him safely back to his waiting army on the far shore. Turnus emerged from the water, exhausted, yet alive, his heart burning for the final clash. Upriver, deep within the Etruscan pine forests, a vast fleet of 30 war galleys was casting off its mooring lines, heading south toward the battle. The 30 war galleys glided silently down the dark Tyrrhenian coast, their wooden hulls cutting through gentle waters. Aeneas sat at the helm of his flagship, guiding the fleet through the starlit night. Beside him sat young Prince Pallas, looking up at the vast constellations. The boy asked quiet questions about the stars, the ocean paths, and the long trials Aeneas had endured. Aeneas answered with soft patience, sharing the quiet wisdom of a man who had lost everything. In the deep hours before dawn, a wondrous sight materialized alongside the flagship. Shimmering forms rose gracefully out of the dark water, swimming alongside the fleet. They were the sea nymphs, the very ships that Turnus had attempted to burn at the riverbank. The mother goddess Cybele had granted them immortal life in the deep blue sea. Their leader, Cymodocia, reached up to grasp the wooden stern of Aeneas's ship. "Awake, son of Venus," she spoke softly, her voice like the rustle of a gentle tide. She warned Aeneas of the fierce siege taking place at his river fortress. She revealed that young Ascanius and the Trojans were surrounded by Rutulian spears. "Make haste," the nymph urged quietly, "for dawn brings the hour of ultimate battle." With a gentle stroke of her divine hand, she pushed the flagship forward, speeding it across the water. As the morning sun broke over the hills of Latium, the fleet approached the river mouth. Aeneas stood high upon the golden prow of his ship, holding aloft his divine shield. The polished metal caught the morning light, blazing like a bright crimson star over the ocean. From their wooden battlements, the weary Trojan defenders looked out and saw the shining light. A massive cheer rose from the fortress ramparts, echoing across the plain. Their leader had returned. Turnus looked toward the shoreline, amazed by the sudden appearance of the great fleet. He saw 30 war vessels steering directly toward the sandy beach. Yet the Rutulian prince felt no fear, only a fierce desire to defend his homeland. "The time has come," Turnus declared to his captains. "Stop them at the water's edge before they touch firm ground." Turnus rushed his army down to the surf, meeting the landing forces in the churning water. Etruscan war galleys struck the shallow sandbars, warriors leaping into the foaming waves. King Tarchon drove his flagship directly onto the beach, snapping the heavy wooden keel. Warriors waded through the surf, swords drawn, battling Rutulian spearmen along the shoreline. Aeneas leaped into the shallow water, his divine armor deflecting a shower of bronze spears, carved a path through the defenders, securing a foothold upon the sandy beach. Young Pallas led his Arcadian cavalry into the fierce fighting. The Arcadians were accustomed to fighting on rocky hills, not slippery sea sand. Seeing his men waver, Pallas leaped from his horse, shouting words of encouragement. "Where do you turn, my friends?" Pallas called out over the sound of clashing iron. "By our king's name, follow me into the line." The young prince fought with magnificent courage, striking down Rutulian captains in the surf. His bravery inspired the Arcadians, who rallied behind their young leader, yet across the crowded beach. Turnus spotted the young Arcadian prince. Turnus urged his war chariot forward through the sand, seeking out the youth. "Stand back, my comrades," Turnus commanded his men. "This fight belongs to me alone." Pallas looked upon the towering Rutulian prince with steady, fearless eyes. He knew Turnus was vastly superior in strength and experience. Yet he refused to retreat. Pallas raised his eyes to the heavens, offering a quiet prayer to Hercules, high above on Mount Olympus. Hercules heard the boy's prayer and wept silently, yet Jupiter gently touched Hercules' shoulder, speaking soft, tragic words. "Every mortal has their appointed day." The king of gods whispered, "Life is brief, but virtue lives forever through great deeds." Pallas hurled his spear with all his youthful strength. The weapon grazed Turnus's heavy shield, scratching the bronze armor beneath. Turnus stepped forward, holding his massive oak spear tipped with sharp iron. "See if my spear strikes deeper," Turnus said softly. He cast his heavy weapon across the sand, piercing Pallas's shield and leather breastplate. The sharp iron point drove deep into the young prince's chest. Pallas collapsed onto the beach, his golden hair falling into the damp sea sand. Turnus stood over the fallen youth, looking down with cold, quiet triumph. "Arcadians," Turnus spoke to the grieving soldiers nearby. "Take your prince home to King Evander, as he deserves. Tell his father that I return Pallas, honored as a warrior." Turnus placed his heavy boot upon the fallen boy's chest. He reached down and stripped away Pallas's massive bronze sword belt. The heavy belt was decorated with intricate gold carvings depicting a tragic mythic slaughter. Turnus strapped the stolen trophy across his own shoulder, proud of his victory. It was a dark, tragic choice that would shape the destiny of Latium. News of Pallas's tragic fall reached Aeneas across the bloody beach. A cold, crushing sorrow struck the Trojan prince, instantly transformed into overwhelming fury. He remembered King Evander, who had trusted him to bring his young son back safely. He remembered the simple dinner they had shared at the rustic Palatine Hill. A terrifying rage, unyielding and absolute, filled Aeneas's heart. Aeneas cut a terrifying swath through the Rutulian lines, seeking Turnus. No armor could withstand his divine blade. No warrior could stay his swift advance. Enemies fled before his dark fury, terrified by the fiery light of his eyes. High above, Queen Juno saw that Aeneas would slay Turnus if they met upon the beach. She pleaded with Jupiter to allow her to save the Rutulian prince, if only for a brief hour. Juno fashioned a dark phantom out of mist, shaped in the exact likeness of Aeneas. The phantom wore fake armor, holding a phantom sword and shield. The ghost moved before Turnus on the battlefield, shouting mock taunts. Believing he was facing the true Trojan leader, Turnus gave chase. The phantom retreated onto an Etruscan merchant ship tied to a nearby wooden pier. Turnus leaped onto the wooden deck, chasing the illusion into the ship's hold. The moment he stepped aboard, Juno snapped the mooring ropes with divine power. The vessel drifted swiftly out into the open sea, carried away by offshore winds. Inside the dark hold, the phantom dissolved into harmless air. Turnus realized he had been tricked, standing at the ship's stern in bitter agony. "Where do you take me, Lord Jupiter?" Turnus wept into the ocean wind as the battlefield vanished on the horizon, with Prince Turnus swept far down the coast upon the runaway ship. Leadership of the Italian coalition fell to King Mezentius. The exiled Etruscan ruler was a man of dark, terrifying violence, who acknowledged neither the gods nor mortal law. Yet beside him rode his noble son, Lausus, whose heart remained pure despite his father's cruelty. Mezentius charged into the bloody surf, seeking to stem the tide of the Trojan advance. Mezentius carved a ruthless path through the Trojan ranks, his heavy spear striking down warriors in the sand. Yet Aeneas advanced through the mist of battle, his divine armor shining with pale, heavenly light. The Trojan prince hurled his heavy spear, piercing Mezentius's bronze shield and wounding his hip. The wounded tyrant stumbled backward into the surf, unable to stand against Aeneas's advancing blade. Seeing his father in mortal peril, young Lausus rushed forward without a moment's hesitation. The brave youth placed his own small shield between Aeneas's sword and his fallen father. Aeneas paused, warning the boy to step back from a fight far beyond his strength. Yet Lausus refused to abandon his father, raising his sword against the Trojan prince. Aeneas's divine blade pierced the youth's light shield, driving deep into Lausus's chest. Lausus collapsed onto the damp sand, his young life ending in a quiet act of filial devotion. Looking down at the golden-haired boy, Aeneas felt a sudden wave of profound sorrow. He saw in Lausus the same love he carried for his own aging father. Anchises. Aeneas gently lifted the young warrior from the dust, returning his body to his grieving comrades with quiet honor. Deep within a nearby oak grove, Mezentius washed his bleeding wound at the river's edge. When the body of young Lausus was carried into the clearing, a terrible agony struck the father's heart. The tyrant wept openly, smearing dust upon his grey hair as he embraced his dead son. He called for his faithful warhorse, Rabus, speaking to the noble beast as a lifelong friend. "We have lived long, my old companion," Mezentius whispered quietly into the horse's ear. "Today we shall bring back the head of Aeneas, or die together upon the field." Mezentius mounted his charger, riding back onto the sunlit plain with wild, desperate courage. He circled Aeneas, hurling spear after spear at the Trojan leader's divine shield. The heavy bronze shield absorbed every strike, holding firm against the tyrant's fury. Aeneas stepped forward, hurling his own spear straight into the forehead of Mezentius's warhorse. The stallion reared in agony, collapsing backward and pinning Mezentius beneath its weight, accepting his end. Mezentius looked up at Aeneas with calm, unyielding eyes. "Do not speak of mercy to a man who has lost his son." The tyrant spoke softly. He offered his throat to Aeneas's blade, asking only to be buried in the earth alongside Lausus. Aeneas drove his sword home, ending the life of the Etruscan ruler upon the quiet plain, with night falling over the bloody shoreline. The terrible fighting finally ceased. Aeneas returned to his quiet tent, where young Pallas lay upon a bed of green oak branches. Tears welled in Aeneas's eyes as he wrapped the boy in a purple robe woven long ago by Dido. A solemn procession of 1,000 soldiers began the long march upriver, carrying the fallen prince back to Palanteum. King Evander met the procession at the village gates, collapsing over his son's body in silent sorrow. The old king embraced the dead youth, his tears falling upon the boy's golden hair, yet Evander did not blame Aeneas for the tragedy, knowing his son had fought with noble courage. "I ask only one thing of you, Aeneas." The grieving king sent word down the river. "Send me the news that Turnus has paid for Pallas's life." The next morning, envoys from King Latinus arrived at the Trojan camp carrying olive branches. They requested a temporary truce to gather and bury the uncounted dead scattered across the plains. Aeneas received the messengers with gentle dignity, granting 12 days of absolute peace. "I came not to make war upon your people," Aeneas assured the Latin envoys softly. "I came only to claim the home promised to us by fate." Inside the royal palace of Laurentum, bitter arguments erupted among the Italian leaders. The elder statesman Drances spoke out against Turnus, blaming his pride for the slaughter of their youth, having landed far down the coast and returned. Turnus stood before the council with defiant anger. "If Aeneas seeks me alone," Turnus declared proudly into the hall, "I shall meet him in single combat." When the 12-day truce expired, the war flared once more across the dusty plains. Queen Camilla led her Volscian cavalry into the front lines. A force of terrifying speed and skill, she swept across the battlefield like a storm, striking down Etruscan and Trojan champions with bow and battle-axe. Yet an Etruscan warrior named Aruns stalked the warrior queen from the shadowed brush. As Camilla pursued a richly armored priest, Aruns cast his spear, striking her beneath the breast. Camilla fell from her charger into the dust, her life slipping away as her maidens wept nearby, with their noble champion dead. The Volscian cavalry broke into total panic, fleeing the field. Panicked Latin troops surged back through the gates of Laurentum, seeking sanctuary behind stone ramparts. Turnus looked out over his retreating army, realizing that all foreign aid had failed. The time for vast armies had passed, leaving only one final, unavoidable duel. Turnus walked into the royal palace of Laurentum, his heart heavy with dark resolve. He saw the fearful eyes of the Latin elders and the quiet tears of Queen Amata. The time for massive armies and grand speeches was over. "The war shall end by my hand alone," Turnus declared quietly into the hall. He sent a herald to the Trojan camp with a formal challenge to Aeneas. Let both armies draw back, clearing a wide space upon the plain before the city walls. Whichever leader survived the single combat would claim Princess Lavinia's hand. Whichever nation lost would bow quietly to the decrees of fate. Old King Latinus pleaded with the young prince to reconsider. He offered Turnus vast lands elsewhere in Italy, and other noble maidens to wed. "Do not throw your young life away against a warrior backed by heaven." Latinus wept, yet Turnus remained unyielding, his pride and devotion driving him forward. Across the plain, Aeneas received the Rutulian challenge with calm satisfaction. He had long sought an end to the slaughter of innocent lives. Aeneas strapped on his gleaming divine armor forged by Vulcan. "The terms are acceptable," the Trojan prince replied softly. "Let the gods decide." At dawn, a massive crowd gathered on the open fields beneath the city ramparts. Trojan and Latin soldiers marked out the sacred boundaries for the duel. They set down their heavy bronze shields and planted spears in the grass, becoming peaceful witnesses. Altars were raised in the center of the field, burning with incense and sacred leaves. King Latinus rode out in a golden chariot, wearing his sacred crown. Aeneas stepped forward from his lines, glowing like a star in his divine bronze. Beside him walked young Aeneas, representing the future lineage of their people. Together, the leaders offered sacred libations over the burning altars, swearing solemn oaths. If Turnus prevailed, the Trojans promised to retreat peacefully to King Evander's hills. If Aeneas won, the Trojans would not enslave the Latins or demand a harsh tribute. Both nations would unite under equal laws, living together as one peaceful people. The sacred treaties were sealed in the presence of sky, earth, and ocean. High above the plain, Queen Juno watched the sacred ceremony with bitter sorrow. She knew that Turnus was no match for Aeneas in single combat. Desperate to save the Rutulian prince, she summoned his divine sister, Juturna. Juturna was a water nymph ruling over Latium's clear springs and rivers. Save your brother if you have the power. Juno urged the nymph softly. Break this peaceful treaty before Turnus steps into the ring. Juturna descended swiftly to the plain, taking the form of a respected Rutulian captain. She walked among the Italian troops, whispering poisonous doubts into their minds. Are you content to watch one man fight for the freedom of all? Juturna murmured. If Turnus falls, we shall become slaves to foreign refugees. To seal her deception, Juturna unleashed a mysterious sign in the sky above. A great golden eagle swooped down, snatching a swan from a flock near the river. Yet the flock of river birds turned and swarmed the great eagle together. They battered the heavy bird with their wings until it dropped the swan into the water. The Latin seer Tolumnius leaped up, misinterpreting the omen with frantic joy. The gods command us to defend our leader, the seer shouted. Tolumnius hurled his heavy bronze spear across the boundary into the Trojan lines. The sharp blade struck down one of 9 Arcadian brothers standing in the front row. A collective gasp echoed across the quiet plain, followed by sudden, wild fury. The sacred truce was broken, and absolute chaos erupted once more. Aeneas ran into the middle of the field, bareheaded, holding out his hands in dismay. Halt your weapons, Aeneas shouted over the roar of the crowd. The treaty is bound by sacred oaths. The fight belongs to me alone. Yet as he stood exposed, calling for peace, a stray arrow flew through the air. The sharp bronze point pierced Aeneas's leg, cutting deep into the muscle. No one knew who cast the cowardly shaft, for the author of the strike remained hidden forever. Bleeding heavily, Aeneas was forced to retreat toward his tent, leaning on his spear. Seeing the Trojan leader wounded and withdrawing, Turnus felt a sudden, dark surge of hope. Inside his quiet tent, Aeneas leaned heavily upon his long spear. The elderly physician Iapix worked frantically to extract the deep arrow. His bronze pincers slipped repeatedly against the stubborn iron point. No mortal medicine could dislodge the hidden shaft. High above, Venus watched her son's agony with profound concern. She flew swiftly to Mount Ida, gathering wild dittany leaves. Venus secretly infused the divine herb into the physician's water. The sharp points slipped out effortlessly, healing the flesh instantly. Aeneas stood tall, feeling divine energy rush through his body. He strapped on his leg guards, grasping his bronze shield. He leaned down to embrace young Aeneas in a brief farewell. Learn courage and duty from me, my son. Aeneas spoke softly. Others may teach you good fortune. Aeneas rushed back onto the dusty plain, seeking Turnus. Yet the water nymph Juturna saw the prince return with terror. She threw Turnus's charioteer from his seat, taking the reins. She drove the war chariot in wild, evasive loops across the field. She kept her brother far from Aeneas's path. Aeneas grew weary of pursuing the fleeting chariot. He turned his eyes toward the undefended walls of Laurentum. He realized that attacking the city would compel Turnus to stand. The Trojans swarmed the stone ramparts, hurling firebrands onto roofs. Thick black smoke began to rise over the royal palace. Queen Amata looked out from a high window in sheer terror, believing Turnus was already slain. She gave way to despair. The queen ended her own life, hanging from a dark beam far out on the plain. Turnus heard the distant wailing. He saw the thick smoke rising above his homeland's towers. He realized that dodging his fate had only brought deeper tragedy. Turnus commanded Juturna to pull the chariot to a halt. "Let me fight him now, sister." Turnus spoke softly into the wind. "Whatever fortune remains, I shall face it alone." Turnus stepped down onto the dusty plain, walking toward Aeneas. Aeneas turned back from the city walls, his eyes fixed upon his enemy. Both armies fell into a profound, breathless silence. The Trojan and Latin soldiers backed away, clearing the central ground. High above, Jupiter sent a dark divine spirit down to the field. Dark spirit flitted before Turnus, a chilling omen of finality. Juturna recognized the sign, weeping softly as she withdrew into her river springs. Turnus stood alone upon the plain, stripped of divine assistance. His eyes caught an ancient boundary stone resting in the grass. It was a massive rock, so heavy 12 men could scarcely lift it. Turnus tried to raise the stone over his head, but his knees trembled. His strength failed him, and the heavy rock fell short into the dust. Aeneas stepped forward, his divine spear held high. He cast the heavy weapon with the full force of his arm. The bronze point shattered Turnus's shield, piercing his thigh. The Rutulian prince collapsed onto one knee in the dust. A collective groan rose from the Latin ranks watching from the walls. Turnus raised his hand in quiet defeat, looking up at his enemy. "I have earned my fate." Turnus spoke softly, his voice steady. "I ask for no mercy, yet consider my aging father, Daunus. Return my body to my people. Spare my life if you choose." Aeneas stood over the fallen prince, his hand lingering upon his sword hilt. The Trojan prince hesitated, deeply moved by the appeal to fatherhood. Mercy hovered in the quiet air between the two warriors. Then, Aeneas's eyes caught a glint of gold upon Turnus's shoulder. It was the heavy bronze sword belt of young Pallas. Turnus wore the stolen trophy proudly across his chest. At the sight of the belt, memory and crushing sorrow flooded Aeneas's heart. He remembered King Evander, who had trusted him with his only son. Rage, pure and absolute, erased all hesitation from his soul. "Shall you escape me while wearing the spoils of my beloved Pallas?" Aeneas cried. "Pallas strikes this blow. Pallas exacts your life." Aeneas drove his sword home, ending the long conflict. Turnus's limbs grew cold, his spirit fleeing with a groan into the underworld. The long, bloody war in Latium was over. The path to destiny was finally clear. In the days that followed, the divine pact of Jupiter was fulfilled. The Trojans and Latins united under equal laws, becoming one people. The Trojan name faded gently into memory, but their bloodline endured. They adopted the Latin language, the Latin customs, and the Latin name from this sacred union. The great city of Rome was born for 11 long years. The poet Virgil crafted this magnificent story. He created an epic not merely of conquest, but of profound human cost. Every step toward empire was bought with tears and quiet sacrifice. Creusa, Dido, Anchises, Nissus, Euryalus, Pallas, and Turnus all paid the price for a future they would never see. Aeneas carried his father upon his shoulders out of burning Troy. He carried his son by the hand across vast, stormy seas, and upon his shoulders he bore the weight of a world yet to come. The long journey of the exile has reached its quiet, peaceful end. The ancient embers of Troy have faded into the quiet soil of Latium. The ocean's storms have stilled, and the river Tiber flows peacefully into the sea. The sacred household gods have found their permanent home at last. The long epic is complete, and the world is at peace. Close your eyes now, and let the quiet darkness embrace you. Feel the deep stillness of the ancient landscape settling around you. The fires of battle are extinguished, leaving only warmth and quiet rest. Drift off peacefully into deep, undisturbed sleep.